The restoration crew tearing down the east wall of Thornbury Hall in rural South Carolina made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Carved into the interior bricks, hidden behind layers of plaster applied decades ago, were 47 names. Some deeply etched with deliberate precision, others barely visible scratches in the clay, as if carved by trembling hands in darkness. Each name had a date beside it. Each date fell between March and October of 1859. When the lead contractor cross-referenced these names with historical records at the Beaufort County Archives, he found something that made his hands shake so badly he had to set down the documents. Every single one of those names belonged to enslaved people who were officially recorded as having been sold away from Thornbury Hall during that same year. But the record showed they were sold to a plantation in Alabama called Riverside, a place that, according to county archives, land surveys, and agricultural census data from 3 different states, had never actually existed. Not on any map, not in any registry, not in anyone's memory. Tonight, we're going to uncover what really happened during those 7 months in 1859, why 47 people vanished into a fiction, and why no one spoke about it, until workers pulled down a wall 158 years later, and the dead finally got to tell their story. Before we continue with the story of Thornbury Hall, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment below and let us know what state or city you're listening from. And if you've ever heard local whispers about plantations with dark secrets hidden in their walls. Now, let's step back to where it all began. In a corner of the American South where cotton was king and silence was the price of survival. Thornbury Hall sat on the northern edge of Beaufort County, close enough to the coast that on humid summer mornings you could smell salt in the air, but far enough inland that the soil was that rich, dark earth that made plantation owners wealthy. The Thornbury family had built their fortune on rice and indigo in the late 1700s, when South Carolina was still finding its economic footing in the new republic. But by the 1850s, they'd switched to cotton like nearly everyone else, recognizing that white gold was the future. The plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres of cultivated land, with another 200 acres of pine forests and swampland that provided timber and hunting grounds. The main house was a monument to wealth extracted from human suffering. A grand 3-story structure with wide verandas that wrapped around the first and second floors, massive white columns that seemed too elegant for the brutality they overlooked, and floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed the family to survey their domain from the comfort of silk-upholstered furniture. The house sat on a slight rise, positioned deliberately so that the family could see the fields below, the rows of cotton stretching toward the horizon, and the small village of slave quarters nearly a quarter-mile away, far enough that the sounds of suffering didn't disturb the family's sleep, but close enough that overseers could reach them quickly when labor was needed. Samuel Thornbury inherited the estate in October of 1856, when his father, Edmund Thornbury, died of yellow fever during an unusually brutal outbreak that swept through the Low Country that year. Samuel was 32 years old, educated at the College of Charleston where he'd studied classical literature and philosophy, well-traveled for a man of his era. He'd spent 6 months in Europe in his 20s, visiting Paris and Rome and London, places that made him feel sophisticated and worldly when he returned to the provincial confines of South Carolina society. Samuel was known throughout Beaufort as a man of contradictions, the kind of person who made neighbors uncertain whether to trust him or fear him. He could quote Rousseau and Jefferson at dinner parties, speaking eloquently about natural rights and the social contract and the responsibilities that came with stewardship of land and people. He donated generously to the Episcopal Church, funded the construction of a new school building in Beaufort, and was known to forgive debts owed to him by neighboring families who'd fallen on hard times. Yet he was also a man who demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience from the 114 enslaved people who worked his land, who would smile warmly while negotiating cotton prices with Charleston merchants, and then turn cold and expressionless when dealing with matters concerning the people who picked that cotton. Local merchants noted how Samuel seemed to view enslaved people not as human beings, but as investments that needed to be managed efficiently. He kept meticulous records, not just of labor outputs and crop yields, but of births, deaths, illnesses, and what he called behavioral patterns. He'd hired a physician from Charleston to examine his enslaved workforce twice a year, not out of concern for their well-being, but to assess their market value and identify potential health issues that might affect productivity. When neighboring planters spoke nostalgically about the old paternalistic traditions, the notion that slaveholders had a duty to care for their people in exchange for their labor, Samuel would listen politely but privately dismiss such sentiments as economically irrational sentimentality. His wife, Margaret, was a Savannah native, the daughter of a successful merchant who'd made his fortune in the shipping trade before retiring to a comfortable estate outside the city. She'd married Samuel in 1848, drawn by the Thornbury name and the social standing that came with it. Margaret was a woman who lived for appearances. She spent extraordinary amounts of time and money planning elaborate gatherings for neighboring plantation families, maintaining the careful social hierarchies that defined their world, and ensuring that Thornbury Hall was recognized as one of the finest estates in the region. She had strong opinions about which families were worthy of association and which were beneath their notice, and she enforced these distinctions with the ruthlessness of someone whose own security depended on maintaining rigid social structures. The couple had 2 children, William, age 8 in 1859, and Catherine, age 5. William was being groomed to eventually take over the plantation, already accompanying his father on walks through the fields and learning to read the ledgers that tracked every aspect of the estate's operations. Catherine was being raised to be a proper Southern lady, learning needlework and French and piano, skills that would make her an attractive match for another wealthy family's son when she came of age. By all external appearances, they were a typical wealthy Southern family of the era, navigating the increasingly tense political climate as debates about secession grew louder across the region and extremists on both sides pushed the nation toward confrontation. But beneath the surface, problems were developing that Samuel worked hard to conceal from his neighbors and even from his wife. The Thornbury fortune, while substantial, was not as secure as it appeared. Samuel's father, Edmund, had made some ill-advised investments in the early 1850s, purchasing land in the Carolina backcountry that turned out to be far less productive than promised, and extending credit to merchants who defaulted when cotton prices fluctuated. When Samuel inherited the estate, he also inherited debts that weren't immediately obvious: loans from Charleston banks, promissory notes to other planters, and a complicated arrangement with a factor in Liverpool who'd advanced money against future cotton deliveries. Samuel had spent the first 2 years of his inheritance trying to resolve these financial problems through conventional means: improving crop yields, reducing unnecessary expenses, selling off marginal land. But by late 1858, it was becoming clear that these measures wouldn't be sufficient. He needed capital, and he needed it quickly, before his creditors lost patience and before his financial troubles became public knowledge that would destroy his social standing. It was during this period of financial strain that Samuel received a letter that would change everything. The letter came from Charleston, from a man named Dr. Nathaniel Hewitt, who introduced himself as a physician with interests in anatomical research and medical education. Dr. Hewitt explained that he was working on a private research project that required, and here the language became carefully vague, human subjects for anatomical study and experimental procedures. He was willing to pay significantly for specimens delivered in good condition, and he could guarantee absolute discretion. The compensation he offered for each subject was substantial, far more than Samuel could get from simply selling enslaved people to other plantations, and the transactions would be structured in ways that would leave no trail leading back to their actual purpose. Samuel read that letter 3 times, each time feeling a different emotion. First, shock at what was being proposed, then disgust at the clinical, detached language that reduced human beings to specimens and subjects, And finally, and this was what frightened him most about his own character, calculation. He began doing the mathematics in his head, figuring out how many people he'd need to sell to Dr. Hewitt to resolve his financial problems, and whether he could structure the transactions in ways that wouldn't raise suspicions among his neighbors or his wife. For several weeks, Samuel tried to push the idea out of his mind. He told himself he was not the kind of man who would do such a thing, that there were moral boundaries he wouldn't cross, regardless of financial pressure. But the creditors kept sending letters, and the numbers in his ledgers kept getting worse, and gradually he began to rationalize. These people were property. He had the legal right to sell them. What happened to them after they left his plantation was not his responsibility. If he didn't find a solution to his financial problems, he might lose Thornbury Hall entirely, and then what would happen to Margaret and the children? Wasn't his first duty to his family? By January of 1859, Samuel had convinced himself that he had no choice. He wrote back to Dr. Hewitt, agreeing in principle to the arrangement, but insisting on certain conditions. The transactions had to appear completely legitimate. Proper bills of sale, a fictional but plausible destination, prices that wouldn't attract attention. Dr. Hewitt would handle the actual transport once Samuel delivered the people to a specified location outside Charleston. And most importantly, Samuel would select people who wouldn't be immediately missed, those without close family connections at Thornbury Hall, or those whose disappearance could be easily explained. Dr. Hewitt agreed to all of Samuel's conditions. They arranged for an initial delivery of 7 people in early March, with the understanding that if the transaction went smoothly, they would continue on a regular basis throughout the spring and summer, until Samuel's financial obligations were satisfied. But Samuel realized he faced a practical problem. He couldn't simply load enslaved people into a wagon and transport them to Charleston without raising questions from his wife, his overseer, and the enslaved community itself. He needed a plausible reason to isolate certain individuals from the rest of the plantation, to keep them separated and controlled until the moment of transport. And he needed to ensure that when they disappeared, there would be a paper trail pointing to a legitimate sale to another plantation, one far enough away that no one would bother to verify the details. This was when Samuel conceived the renovation plan. Thornbury Hall was old, and like all old houses, it constantly needed repairs and updates. Samuel decided he would undertake a significant renovation project on the east wing of the main house. Structural reinforcement, he would explain, to address water damage and settling that threatened the building's stability. He would select enslaved workers with skills in carpentry and masonry for this project, explaining that the work required skill and discretion since it involved the main house where the family lived. These workers would be isolated from the rest of the plantation population, housed separately, working under the close supervision of someone Samuel trusted absolutely. The problem was that Samuel didn't have anyone he trusted absolutely. His current overseer, a man named Horace Gentry, had worked for Samuel's father for 12 years. Gentry was competent, but also observant and prone to asking questions when things didn't make sense. He would notice if workers were isolated for an implausibly long renovation project. He would wonder why some of them disappeared before the work was finished. Samuel needed someone new, someone who had no history with the plantation, someone who would follow orders without questioning their purpose. In February of 1859, Samuel dismissed Horace Gentry, offering him a generous severance package and a glowing letter of recommendation that helped Gentry quickly find a position with another planter near Columbia. Samuel explained to Margaret and to his neighbors that he'd decided he wanted someone with a different management style, someone less tied to his father's old ways of doing things. Then he hired Virgil Crane. Crane arrived at Thornbury Hall on February 21st, coming from somewhere in the Western Carolina backcountry, with no references, no history that anyone could verify, and a reputation that preceded him in whispers rather than documented facts. Other planters knew of Crane, or at least knew stories about him, as a man who specialized in difficult situations, a phrase that covered everything from breaking the spirit of enslaved people who'd attempted escape to managing plantations where previous overseers had failed to maintain control. Crane was in his early 40s, tall and lean, with a face that seemed incapable of expression, as if emotion had been surgically removed from his features. He spoke rarely, and when he did speak, his voice was flat and uninflected, delivering orders and observations with the same mechanical tone one might use to describe the weather. He carried a coiled whip on his belt always, though witnesses noted that he rarely needed to use it. His presence alone was usually sufficient to ensure compliance. The enslaved community at Thornbury Hall sensed immediately that something had changed with Crane's arrival. The atmosphere became heavier, more oppressive. Crane walked the property at all hours, appearing unexpectedly in places where overseers normally never went, watching people work with those expressionless eyes, making notes in a small leather journal he kept in his coat pocket. He didn't engage in the performative brutality that some overseers use to establish dominance. There were no public whippings or demonstrations meant to terrorize. Instead, Crane's control was quieter and somehow more frightening because of how systematic it was. People who violated rules or failed to meet work quotas would simply disappear into the disciplinary building for hours or sometimes days, and when they returned, they wouldn't speak about what had happened. The enslaved community at Thornbury Hall, like enslaved communities throughout the South, had developed its own internal structures of support, communication, and survival. There was Eliza, a woman in her mid-50s who worked in the main house as the primary cook and housekeeper. She'd been born at Thornbury Hall, had raised Samuel from infancy after his mother died in childbirth with a stillborn daughter, and held a position of complicated trust that gave her access to information others didn't have. Eliza was literate, secretly taught by Samuel's father's sister, a woman with abolitionist sympathies who'd visited the plantation in the 1820s and who'd believed that education was a fundamental human right. Eliza had taught others to read over the years, conducting clandestine lessons in the quarters late at night, creating a small network of literate people who could read newspapers, documents, and the signs that warned of danger. There was Marcus, a skilled carpenter in his late 30s whose father had been brought directly from the coast of West Africa in the illegal slave trade that continued long after it was officially outlawed. Marcus had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather's homeland, fragments of language and culture that his father had desperately tried to preserve, and he'd inherited his father's skill with woodwork, an almost intuitive understanding of how wood behaved, how joints should be constructed, how to make furniture or structures that would last generations. Samuel's father had recognized Marcus's talent and had given him special status as the plantation's primary carpenter, a position that came with slightly better living conditions and a small degree of autonomy. There was Ruth, barely 17 years old, who worked in the kitchen under Eliza's supervision. Ruth had been born at Thornbury Hall to parents who'd both died of fever when she was young, and Eliza had essentially raised her, teaching her not just cooking but observation, how to listen to conversations without appearing to listen, how to read the moods and intentions of white people, how to recognize when danger was approaching. Ruth had a sharp, analytical mind that noticed when things didn't add up, when explanations didn't match observed facts. There was Daniel, a field worker in his mid-30s who'd been sold to Thornbury Hall 5 years earlier, when his previous owner died and the estate was liquidated. Daniel had been separated from his wife and 3 children in that sale. They'd gone to a plantation in Georgia while Daniel came to South Carolina, and the loss had left him quiet and watchful, always paying attention, always looking for patterns, always preparing for the next disaster. Other enslaved people at Thornbury Hall recognized Daniel as someone whose pain had made him strong, someone who could be trusted in crisis because he'd already survived the worst thing he could imagine. There was James, Ruth's older brother by 3 years, who worked as a mason and general laborer. James had inherited his father's physical strength and his mother's stubborn pride, a dangerous combination in an enslaved person. He'd been whipped twice in the past year for what overseers called insolence. looking white men in the eye too long, responding to questions with insufficient deference, working at a pace that suggested he was doing the minimum required rather than giving his maximum effort. Eliza worried constantly about James, knowing that his pride would eventually get him killed if he didn't learn to bend more convincingly. These 5 people, Eliza, Marcus, Ruth, Daniel, and James, formed the core of Thornbury Hall's informal, enslaved community leadership. They weren't leaders in any official sense, but they were the people others turned to for guidance, for interpretation of the white family's moods and intentions, for the small acts of protection and solidarity that made survival possible. And all 5 of them sensed that something was terribly wrong in the late winter of 1859. The signs were subtle at first. Samuel stopped making eye contact with Eliza during their brief daily interactions when she served his meals or cleaned his study. Margaret became more irritable, complaining constantly about expenses and insisting that Samuel explain why certain household purchases needed to be delayed. Virgil Crane walked the property with a surveyor's attention, measuring distances, examining the structure of buildings, spending long periods studying the east wing of the main house. Then, Samuel announced the renovation project. He gathered the enslaved community one evening in late February and explained that extensive work needed to be done on the main house. Structural reinforcement to address water damage that threatened the building's integrity. He would be selecting workers with carpentry and masonry skills for this important project. These workers would be housed separately during the renovation period to ensure they were available whenever needed, since the work involved the family's living spaces and required discretion and care. To most of the assembled people, this announcement seemed unremarkable. Renovation projects were common, and it made sense that Samuel would want skilled workers living nearby for convenience. But Eliza felt unease crawling up her spine. She'd worked in that house for 40 years and had never noticed any water damage in the east wing. Marcus, with his carpenter's eye for structural problems, had done repair work throughout the main house over the past decade and knew that the east wing was actually one of the most solid sections of the building. Neither of them said anything publicly, but that night in the quarters, Eliza found Marcus and shared her concerns. "Something's wrong," she said quietly. "I don't know what, but Samuel's lying about that water damage." Marcus nodded slowly. "The bricks in that wall are sound. I examined them just last month when I was repairing the window frames. There's no water damage, no settling. The structure is solid." "Then why is he doing this?" Eliza asked. Marcus had no answer, but over the following days, they both watched carefully, noting details that might reveal Samuel's true intentions. On the morning of March 3rd, 1859, everything began to unravel. The plantation bell rang at an unusual hour, not the typical dawn wake-up call, but a sharp, insistent clanging at mid-morning that meant something different was happening. Virgil Crane stood near the bell, and as enslaved workers gathered, confused by the irregular summons, he read names from a list in his leather journal. Marcus, James, Samuel, Grace, Thomas, Rebecca, John. 7 names. 7 people called forward from the assembled crowd. Marcus felt ice in his stomach as Crane explained that they'd been selected for the renovation work. They were to gather their belongings immediately and report to the storage building near the main house, where they'd be staying for the duration of the project. It wasn't uncommon for enslaved people to be assigned to special projects that required them to stay near the main house. But something about the way Crane delivered the information, that flat, mechanical tone, those expressionless eyes, made Marcus deeply uneasy. He glanced at James, saw the same wariness reflected in the younger man's face. The 7 of them collected their few belongings and followed Crane to the storage building, a sturdy brick structure that had once been used for keeping valuable equipment and supplies. Crane had converted it into temporary quarters, bedrolls on the floor, a single bucket for water, another for waste. No windows, just a single door that Crane locked from the outside after explaining that security was necessary since they'd be working in the main house where the family's valuables were kept. The next morning, they began work on the east wing. Samuel himself came to inspect the site, explaining in careful detail what he wanted done. The plaster needed to be stripped from the interior walls of 2 large rooms on the ground floor. Then they would examine the brickwork beneath, resetting any loose bricks and reinforcing the structural integrity. After that, they'd replaster the walls, creating a smooth surface for new wallpaper. Marcus, examining the walls as they stripped away the old plaster, found exactly what he'd expected. The brickwork underneath was in excellent condition. The mortar was solid. The bricks themselves showed no signs of water damage or structural stress. This entire project was unnecessary from an engineering standpoint. He said nothing, but his mind raced through possibilities. Why would Samuel undertake expensive, time-consuming work that served no structural purpose? What was the real reason for this project? The answer, when it came, was worse than anything Marcus had imagined. They worked for 2 weeks, stripping plaster and carefully examining the brickwork underneath. Crane watched them constantly, hovering at the doorway or sitting in a chair positioned where he could observe everyone simultaneously. The work was tedious and dusty, and the confinement, working all day in these rooms, sleeping locked in the storage building at night, never seeing the rest of the plantation community, began to wear on everyone's nerves. Then, on the morning of March 19th, Thomas wasn't at breakfast. The 6 remaining workers assumed he'd been taken to work on some other task, but when they asked Crane about his absence, the overseer's response sent chills through everyone present. Thomas was sold yesterday evening. He left the plantation last night. He's gone and he won't be coming back. You don't need to worry about him. Focus on your work. The statement hung in the air like smoke. Sold yesterday evening, without warning, without announcement, without even a chance to say goodbye to friends or the community he'd lived with. That wasn't how sales normally worked. Even in a system built on cruelty, there were usually at least minimal logistics. Buyers visiting to inspect people before purchase, negotiations that took days or weeks, some advance notice that allowed the person being sold to prepare mentally for the catastrophic disruption of being torn away from everything familiar. Marcus felt dread settling into his bones. He caught James's eye across the room and saw the same fear reflected there. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. They continued working in near silence that day, resetting bricks that didn't need resetting, mixing mortar with hands that shook slightly. That evening, locked again in the storage building, Marcus spoke quietly to the others. This doesn't make sense. Why would Samuel sell Thomas in the middle of a renovation project that supposedly requires our specific skills? And why no warning, no preparation? Grace, a woman in her late 20s who'd worked in the laundry, spoke up. My cousin was sold 2 years ago. The buyer came to inspect her first. There were negotiations that took 3 days. She knew it was coming and had time to say goodbye. This isn't how it works. Rebecca, who'd been quiet until now, voiced what they were all thinking but were afraid to say out loud. What if he wasn't sold? What if something else happened? The question hung unanswered in the darkness. What else could have happened? Where else could Thomas have gone? The only alternative to being sold was escape, but that made no sense. Thomas had been locked in with them the night before, and Crane had been guarding the door. 4 days later, Grace disappeared. Same explanation from Crane. Sold away, already gone, don't ask questions. The remaining 5 workers looked at each other with growing panic. A pattern was emerging, and it was a pattern that pointed toward something far worse than ordinary slave sales. Marcus made a decision that night. He didn't know what was really happening to the people who disappeared, but he knew they needed a record, a testimony, something that would survive even if none of them did. When Crane stepped outside that evening to smoke his pipe, a nightly ritual that gave them perhaps 15 minutes without direct supervision, Marcus found a thick nail among the construction materials and approached the brick wall they'd been working on. The plaster had been stripped away, leaving the brick exposed. In 2 days they would begin replastering, covering the brick forever. Marcus pressed the nail against a brick and began to carve, scratching letters into the clay with desperate precision. Thomas, March 19th, 1859. His hands shook as he worked, carving quickly, listening constantly for the sound of Crane's footsteps returning. Rebecca stood by the door, ready to signal if the overseer came back. James watched with wide eyes, understanding immediately what Marcus was doing and why. When Marcus finished Thomas's name, he started on Grace's. The scratching of metal on brick seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room, but he forced himself to continue, to carve each letter deep enough that it might survive, might someday be seen. Over the following weeks and months, the pattern continued with horrifying regularity. Every few days, sometimes every week, one of the workers would vanish. Crane's explanation never varied. Sold away, already gone. Don't ask questions. And each time, before they plastered over the next section of wall, Marcus carved another name, another date. Rebecca began helping him, her smaller fingers able to reach bricks in corners that Marcus couldn't access. James stood guard, his pride and stubbornness now channeled into this small act of resistance, ensuring that the names would be preserved, that what was happening would be witnessed. Meanwhile, beyond the isolation of their worksite and nightly confinement, the broader enslaved community at Thornbury Hall was growing increasingly alarmed. People were disappearing, sold away according to official announcements, but the pattern made no sense. Samuel was selling off some of his strongest workers during the crucial spring planting season, exactly when labor was most valuable. The prices being paid, according to whispered information that filtered back through Crane, were absurdly low. $20 for a skilled carpenter, $30 for a young, healthy field worker. These weren't market prices. Something was wrong. Eliza, working in the main house, had access that others didn't. She cleaned Samuel's study, served his meals, moved through spaces where conversations happened. She began deliberately lingering when Samuel met with Crane, straining to hear fragments of their discussions. What she learned terrified her. Samuel was drinking heavily, more than she'd ever seen him drink. His hands shook when he signed documents. He'd stopped sleeping in the master bedroom with Margaret, instead taking a small room on the opposite side of the house. He paced at night. Eliza could hear his footsteps in the halls above her quarters in the basement. The man was coming apart, and whatever was causing his dissolution was the same thing that was making people disappear from Thornbury Hall. One evening in early May, Eliza's careful observation paid off in the worst possible way. She was clearing dishes after Samuel had eaten dinner alone in his study. Margaret had taken to dining separately, frustrated by his drinking and his refusal to explain his increasingly erratic behavior. Samuel had drunk most of a bottle of whiskey and was slumped in his chair, papers scattered across his desk. As Eliza gathered dishes, she deliberately fumbled, scattering papers onto the floor. "I'm so sorry, Master Samuel," she said, kneeling quickly to gather them, her eyes scanning every document as her hands moved. Samuel waved dismissively, too drunk to care about the mess. Eliza's eyes moved across letters, ledgers, and bills of sale. Most of it was mundane, cotton prices, correspondence with factors in Charleston, but then she saw something that made her blood turn to ice. A letter, partially hidden under the ledger, written in elegant script on expensive paper. The letterhead read, "Dr. Nathaniel Hewitt, Medical Research, Charleston, South Carolina." Eliza read quickly, her heart pounding. "Mr. Thornbury, I received your latest delivery in good condition. The 3 specimens provided last week were particularly satisfactory for my purposes. The compensation as agreed has been deposited to your account. I will be prepared to accept the next group by the end of this month. I remind you again of the importance of discretion. The subjects should be healthy and capable of transport. I trust you will continue to provide the quality I require. Dr. Hewitt." Eliza felt nausea rising in her throat. Specimens, subjects, delivery. This wasn't about selling people to another plantation. This was something far worse. She carefully returned the papers to the desk, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the dishes. She left the study, moving through the familiar hallways of the house where she'd lived and worked for 40 years. But everything seemed different now, contaminated by the knowledge she carried. She knew about medical schools and anatomists. Word traveled through the enslaved community network. Stories whispered from plantation to plantation, city to city, of bodies stolen from graves, of enslaved people who died mysteriously and whose bodies disappeared before burial, of white doctors who needed corpses for dissection and study and who weren't particular about how they obtained them. The Medical College of South Carolina in Charleston had an anatomy department that required a constant supply of bodies for teaching students surgical techniques. Most of those bodies came from enslaved people because enslaved people had no legal protection, no rights, no one to investigate or question what happened to them after death. But this letter suggested something even worse. Dr. Hewitt wanted subjects delivered in good condition, wanted them healthy and capable of transport. He wasn't buying corpses. He was buying living people. The implications crashed over Eliza in waves of horror. Samuel was selling living people to a doctor who wanted them for medical experimentation. Not dissection after natural death, but experiments on living subjects. Testing surgical procedures that would be too dangerous to try on white patients. Studying human anatomy by cutting into conscious, terrified people. Using enslaved human beings as laboratory animals, as things to be studied and destroyed in the name of advancing medical knowledge. Eliza made it back to her small room in the basement before she vomited, emptying her stomach until there was nothing left but bile. Then she sat on her narrow bed in the darkness and cried, not just for the people who'd already disappeared, Thomas, Grace, John, Samuel, and so many others, but for the ones who would disappear next, and for her own powerlessness to stop it. But powerlessness didn't mean silence. After she'd cried herself empty, Eliza made a decision. She couldn't save the people Samuel was selling to Dr. Hewitt. She had no power to prevent what was happening, but she could bear witness. She could ensure that someone knew the truth. She could make certain that this evil didn't disappear into silence. That night, she found Daniel, the quiet field worker who'd lost his own family years ago. She trusted Daniel because pain had made him strong, had made him someone who could hear terrible truths without breaking. In the darkness behind the quarters, speaking in whispers that couldn't carry beyond their immediate circle, Eliza told Daniel everything she'd learned. Daniel's face showed no emotion as he listened, but his hands clenched into fists so tight that his nails cut crescents into his palms. When Eliza finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice very quiet and very controlled. "We can't stop him. If we try, we'll just be sold to that doctor ourselves or killed. Samuel has the law on his side. He has the power. We have nothing." He paused, then continued, "But we can remember. We can make sure this doesn't get buried. Can you write down what you learned?" Eliza nodded. She'd kept her literacy secret from every white person at Thornberry Hall except Samuel's abolitionist aunt who died years ago. She had paper and ink hidden in her room, stolen bit by bit from Samuel's study over the years. She could create a record. "Write it down," Daniel said. "Everything, names, dates, what you saw in that letter, hide it somewhere safe, and tell others to remember too. If enough people carry this story, maybe someday it will come out. Maybe someday there will be justice." Word spread through the enslaved community at Thornberry Hall, in the careful, coded way that information always traveled in places where surveillance was constant, and betrayal could mean death. Not everyone was told. There were always people who might inform to gain favor with overseers or the family, but a core group of trusted individuals learned what was happening. They began keeping their own records in the ways available to them. Mental notes of who disappeared and when, songs that preserved names in their lyrics, prayers that listed the vanished, small acts of memory that wouldn't save anyone but might ensure that the truth outlived their oppression. Eliza began writing at night, by candlelight, recording everything in a journal she'd constructed from stolen paper, bound with thread from the sewing room. She wrote in cramped handwriting, filling every inch of paper because paper was precious and dangerous. She documented the names of everyone who disappeared, the dates of their vanishing, the fragments of Samuel's letters she'd managed to read, her own observations of his deteriorating mental state. She wrote knowing that if this journal were discovered, she would be killed or sold to Dr. Hewitt herself. But the risk was worth it because someone needed to tell this story. Meanwhile, Marcus, James, and Rebecca continued their work on the wall, now fully understanding that they were likely marking their own graves. The renovation project had taken on a surreal quality. They were building a memorial to themselves, carving names into brick that would be covered with plaster and wallpaper, hidden but preserved, waiting for some future moment when someone might tear down the wall and discover what had been hidden there. By June, more than 30 people had disappeared from Thornbury Hall. The plantation was running short on labor, and neighboring planters were beginning to ask questions. Why was Samuel selling off so many workers during the critical growing season? Was he having financial problems? One neighbor, a man named Jonathan Hayes, who owned the adjacent plantation, came to visit Samuel to express concern and offer assistance if Samuel needed help managing his estate. Samuel, increasingly paranoid and unstable, interpreted Hayes's kind offer as suspicious prying. He refused the assistance brusquely and avoided social interactions with neighboring families. Margaret, humiliated by her husband's behavior and confused by his refusal to explain what was wrong, began telling acquaintances that Samuel was suffering from nervous strain and needed rest. The atmosphere at Thornbury Hall had become oppressive, heavy with fear and anticipation. Everyone knew something terrible was happening, but the full extent of the horror was known only to a few. Crane continued his mechanical enforcement of discipline, showing no emotion, no reaction to the fact that dozens of people had vanished under his watch. Samuel drank himself into stupors most nights, pacing the halls, avoiding the east wing where the renovation work continued. Rebecca was sold away in mid-June. Marcus carved her name into the brick with hands that barely functioned. His fingers cramped from months of the same motion, scratching letters into clay over and over. Rebecca, June 14, 1859. He'd carved 44 names now. 44 people who'd vanished into Dr. Hewitt's medical practice. 44 human beings reduced to specimens and subjects. James was alone now, the last of the original 7, still working on the wall with Crane's expressionless eyes, watching him constantly. The renovation was nearly complete. The brickwork had been reinforced with additional interior layers that made the rooms noticeably smaller, and now only the final plastering remained. James knew what that meant. When the wall was finished, when there was no more work to be done, he would be sold away just like all the others. He continued carving names as long as he could, working by dim lamplight after Crane thought he'd gone to sleep, scratching letters into every available brick surface before it was covered with plaster. Some of the names were people from the original 7. Others were enslaved people from the broader plantation community who'd disappeared over the months. People James had known, worked beside, shared meals with. He carved until his fingers bled, until the nail he was using wore down to a nub, until there were no more exposed bricks left to mark. The last name he carved was his own, James, June 23, 1859. He didn't know if that would be the actual date of his disappearance, but he knew it was coming soon. He added one more thing below his name, a phrase that took him nearly an hour to scratch into the hard brick with his worn-down nail. "We are not forgotten." 3 days later, on the night of June 26th, James made his decision. He had nothing left to lose. His sister Ruth had disappeared in May, sold away like the others. His parents had died years ago. He had no wife or children to protect, no family ties that might be threatened if he resisted. He was already dead. It was just a matter of whether he died passively or fighting. That evening, when Crane brought his meal, James was ready. He'd hidden the plastering trowel under his bedroll, positioning it so he could grab it quickly. When Crane unlocked the door and stepped inside with the plate of food, James attacked. He swung the trowel with desperate fury, aiming for Crane's head. The overseer was larger and stronger, but James had the advantage of surprise and the strength of someone with nothing to lose. The trowel struck Crane's raised arm, cutting a deep gash through fabric and flesh. Crane staggered back, blood flowing from the wound, and James pressed his attack, swinging again and again. But Crane recovered quickly, dropping the plate and grabbing James's wrist with his uninjured hand. They struggled, crashing against the walls of the storage building, James fighting with everything he had while Crane fought with cold, mechanical efficiency. The overseer was simply too strong. He twisted James's wrist until the trowel dropped, then delivered a series of precise blows that left James gasping on the floor. Crane stood over him, blood still flowing from the gash on his arm, his expression unchanged despite the injury. He pulled a length of rope from his coat pocket and bound James's hands and feet with methodical care, then gagged him with a strip of cloth. Then he left, locking the door behind him. James lay in the darkness, knowing what would come next. He'd attacked an overseer, a white man. By the laws of South Carolina, that meant death. Either execution after a brief trial, or summary killing that no one would question or investigate. He'd known the price when he made his attack, and he'd accepted it. At least he'd fought. At least he'd resisted. At least he hadn't gone quietly into Dr. Hewitt's laboratory. But death didn't come that night, or the next day. Instead, 2 days after James's attack, Crane returned with 2 other white men James had never seen before. They loaded him, still bound and gagged, into the back of a covered wagon. The wagon moved out of Thornbury Hall in the darkness of pre-dawn, taking back roads that avoided populated areas. James never saw Thornbury Hall again. The wagon traveled south and then east toward Charleston. They stopped periodically to give him water, but never removed the gag or untied him. After what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 6 or 7 hours, the wagon entered Charleston, passing through streets James had never seen, finally stopping behind a large brick building in a district of warehouses and commercial structures near the docks. Dr. Nathaniel Hewitt met them at the building's rear entrance. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a neat beard, dressed in expensive clothes, looking every bit the respectable physician. He examined James clinically, checking his teeth, his eyes, his reflexes, as if inspecting livestock. Then he counted out money to Crane, who pocketed it without comment and left. James was dragged inside the building, downstairs into a basement that smelled of chemicals and something else, something organic and rotten that made his stomach heave. There were other people there, at least a dozen, all enslaved people from Thornbury Hall and perhaps other plantations, all kept in small cells, all terrified. James saw Ruth in one of the cells and felt his heart break. She was alive, but she wouldn't be for long, and neither would he. What happened in Dr. Hewitt's basement over the following months and years is too horrific to describe in detail, and honestly, we may never know the full extent of it. What we do know, from fragmentary records and later investigations, is that Dr. Hewitt was conducting experimental surgical procedures on living human subjects without anesthesia, testing techniques that would later be used on white patients, but which he wanted to perfect first on people whose suffering didn't matter in the eyes of the law. He was also providing anatomical demonstrations for paying audiences of medical students and wealthy amateurs interested in science, dissecting living people to show how organs functioned, how blood flowed, how the body worked. James survived for nearly 4 months in that basement. Some of the others survived longer. Some died within days of arrival. There was no pattern to who lived and who died, no logic beyond the arbitrary whims of Dr. Hewitt's research needs. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones were kept alive for repeated procedures, their bodies used over and over, until infection or blood loss or simple physiological collapse finally ended their suffering. Ruth died in August. James, too damaged to be useful for further experimentation, died in October. Their bodies, along with the bodies of dozens of others, were burned in the building's furnace, leaving no physical evidence of what had been done to them. Back at Thornbury Hall, Samuel Thornbury was coming apart. The money from Dr. Hewitt had temporarily solved his financial problems. His creditors were paid, his debts satisfied, but the cost to his sanity was catastrophic. He stopped attending church. He stopped socializing with neighbors. He took meals alone in his study and drank himself unconscious most nights. Margaret, at her wits' end, began making plans to take the children and return to her family in Savannah, unable to bear her husband's deterioration any longer. In November of 1859, Samuel made a final decision. He dismissed Virgil Crane without explanation, paying him a large sum of money and giving him documents that would allow him to disappear into the chaos of the pre-war South. Crane took the money and vanished, his name appearing briefly in Georgia records a few years later before he too disappeared from history entirely. Samuel hired a new overseer, a man named Benjamin Crawford, who knew nothing of what had happened and who found the plantation's records oddly incomplete for the previous 9 months. Crawford asked questions about the missing workers, about the bills of sale that pointed to plantations that didn't seem to exist, but Samuel refused to provide explanations, saying only that the sales had been completed properly and the matter was closed. The enslaved community at Thornbury Hall, now reduced to fewer than 70 people, lived with the knowledge of what had happened, but without the power to reveal it. Eliza continued her journal, adding what information she could gather, but the full truth was inaccessible to her. She knew people had been sold to Dr. Hewitt, knew they'd been taken to Charleston, but she didn't know specifically what had been done to them, didn't know that some had survived for months in that basement laboratory, didn't know the exact nature of their suffering. Then came the war. South Carolina seceded in December 1860, and by April 1861, Confederate forces were firing on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The nation tore itself apart, and Thornbury Hall, like plantations across the South, saw its labor force disrupted as enslaved people fled toward Union lines, joined insurrections, or simply disappeared into the confusion of war. Samuel, too old and too mentally unstable to serve in the Confederate Army, remained at the plantation and watched his world collapse. He stopped managing the estate entirely, leaving everything to Crawford while he sequestered himself in his study, drinking and muttering to himself. Servants reported hearing him pace the halls at night, heard him having conversations with people who weren't there, heard him pressing his hands against the walls of those renovated rooms in the East Wing as if trying to feel something hidden beneath the surface. Eliza stayed at Thornbury Hall throughout the war's early years, not out of loyalty, but because she had nowhere else to go, and because she wanted to see how this story ended. She watched Samuel deteriorate, his hair going completely grey, his hands developing a constant tremor, his eyes taking on a haunted quality that suggested he saw things others couldn't. He stopped sleeping in the main bedroom entirely, instead taking a small servant's room on the west side of the house, as far from the East Wing as possible. In May of 1863, Union forces conducted a raid through Beaufort County, burning plantations and liberating enslaved people as they advanced. Thornbury Hall was in their path. The family was given warning. A neighbor rode ahead of the Union forces, shouting for everyone to flee, and Margaret gathered William and Catherine and escaped in a carriage toward Charleston. Samuel refused to leave. When Eliza tried to convince him to evacuate, he shook his head, staring at the wall of the East Wing parlor. "I can't leave," he said quietly. "They're all still here, in the walls. I can hear them at night." Eliza fled with the other enslaved people when the Union forces arrived, finally escaping Thornbury Hall after 43 years of bondage. She looked back as she ran and saw smoke rising from the main house. Someone had set the fire. Whether Union soldiers or Samuel himself, no one ever knew, but the flames spread quickly through the old dry wood. Samuel Thornbury died in that fire. His body was found later in the East Wing, in one of those renovated rooms, burned beyond recognition. Some said he'd been trapped by the flames. Others, including Eliza, believed he'd started the fire himself and stayed in those rooms deliberately, finally accepting responsibility for what he'd done by destroying himself, along with the evidence of his crimes. The fire destroyed much of Thornbury Hall, but not all of it. The walls of the East Wing, built of brick and reinforced during that terrible 1859 renovation, survived. The roof collapsed, the interior was gutted, but the walls stood, charred and battered but intact. Margaret and the children survived, fleeing to Charleston where they lived in reduced circumstances for the remainder of the war. After the Confederacy's defeat, Margaret never returned to Thornbury Hall. She sold the property through a factor for a fraction of its pre-war value, taking the money and moving to Baltimore, where she had distant relatives. She lived until 1871, dying of pneumonia and leaving her children small inheritances. William eventually became a clerk in a shipping company. Catherine married a merchant and moved to Virginia. Neither of them ever spoke about Thornbury Hall or their father's death. The plantation passed through several owners over the following decades. Carpetbaggers bought it cheaply during Reconstruction, trying to operate it with paid labor but finding it unprofitable. Speculators purchased it in the 1880s, hoping land values would rise. A New York family bought it in 1895, intending to use it as a winter estate. But they found the house too damaged and too expensive to restore properly and abandoned the project after a few years. By the early 1900s, Thornbury Hall was mostly deserted. Local families occasionally used parts of the property for farming, and the main house, though severely damaged, remained partially intact. Its bones too sturdy to collapse completely, even as its flesh rotted away. Children told ghost stories about it, claiming they heard voices in the walls, but that was just the kind of legend that attaches itself to any ruined plantation house in the South. Eliza had survived the war and Reconstruction, living into her 80s as a free woman. She settled in Beaufort, working as a seamstress and raising her grandchildren after her daughter died in childbirth. She never spoke publicly about what had happened at Thornbury Hall in 1859. Who would have believed her? She was a black woman in the post-war South, her testimony worth nothing in courts or public opinion. But she told her granddaughter, a girl named Patricia, who grew up hearing the story about the renovation project and the people who disappeared and the names carved into walls. Patricia told her own children, who told their children, passing the story down through generations as family oral history that no one outside the family quite believed. It sounded too horrible, too specific in its evil. Surely if something like that had happened, there would be official records. Surely someone would have investigated. Surely Samuel Thornbury's transactions with Dr. Hewitt would have left some trail that historians could follow. But there were no investigations, at least not at the time. Dr. Nathaniel Hewitt continued his practice in Charleston until late 1859, when whispers about his specimen acquisition methods began circulating among the city's medical community. In January of 1860, the Medical College of South Carolina quietly asked him to discontinue his teaching duties, citing vague irregularities, but providing no specific accusations. A brief notice appeared in the Charleston Mercury newspaper mentioning Dr. Hewitt's departure from the college, but providing no details about why he'd left. Hewitt left Charleston shortly after, and his subsequent whereabouts are unclear. There are records suggesting he may have practiced medicine in Mobile, Alabama for a few years, then possibly in New Orleans. He died sometime in the late 1860s or early 1870s. The exact date and location are lost to history. His papers, including correspondence and research notes, were donated to a medical archive in 1933 by a distant relative who'd inherited them. When historians eventually examined those papers decades later, they found vague references to subjects and acquisitions and anatomical demonstrations. But Hewitt had been careful never to name names or provide specific details that might incriminate him. The bills of sale for the 47 people sold from Thornbury Hall remained in Beaufort County records, gathering dust in archive boxes. Their absurdly low prices raised no questions because who was there to question them? The enslaved people themselves were dead. Samuel Thornbury was dead. Virgil Crane had vanished. And the Riverside Plantation in Alabama remained a fiction that no historian bothered to verify because it was just one entry among thousands in the chaotic, incomplete documentation of slavery. For 158 years, the names stayed hidden in the wall. They survived the fire that killed Samuel Thornbury, survived decades of neglect and slow structural decay, survived the indifference of multiple owners who didn't care about the building's history. The plaster cracked and fell away in some places, exposing brick underneath, but no one thought to examine those bricks carefully. No one had any reason to think they might contain testimony carved by people desperate to be remembered. Then, in 2015, things began to change. A historical preservation society in South Carolina, funded by donations and grants, decided to undertake an ambitious project, restoring Thornbury Hall as a historic site and museum that would tell the story of plantation life from multiple perspectives, including the experiences of enslaved people who'd lived and worked there. It was part of a broader movement to complicate and challenge the romanticized lost cause narratives that had dominated Southern historical sites for more than a century. The Preservation Society purchased the Thornbury Hall property in early 2016 and began the lengthy process of assessing what could be saved and what would need to be rebuilt. The main house was in terrible condition. The roof was mostly gone, interior floors had collapsed, walls were crumbling. But the architectural assessment concluded that the fundamental structure could be stabilized and restored, though it would require extensive work and significant funding. In March of 2017, the restoration began. A crew from Charleston was hired, specialists in historic preservation, who understood the delicate balance between maintaining authenticity and making the building safe for visitors. The crew's leader was a man named David Hoskins, a fourth-generation carpenter whose great-grandfather had worked on similar restoration projects during the Depression. David approached the work with reverence and meticulous attention to detail. Every element of the original construction was documented, photographed, measured. When boards had to be replaced, David's crew tried to source period-appropriate materials. When modern interventions were necessary for safety, electrical systems, HVAC, structural reinforcements, they were designed to be as invisible as possible. The crew worked through the summer of 2017, making slow progress. The East Wing required particularly careful attention because the 1863 fire had damaged it severely. Paradoxically, though, the fire had also strengthened certain elements. The intense heat had baked the bricks harder, fusing them into formations that were extraordinarily stable. On the morning of October 12, 2017, David's crew began carefully removing a section of interior wall in what historical records indicated had been the parlor. The plaster was incredibly unstable, crumbling at the slightest touch. Standard procedure was to remove it carefully, documenting any original wallpaper or paint underneath, then replaster using period-appropriate techniques. One of the crew members, a young woman named Lisa Chen, who'd recently graduated from a historic preservation program at Clemson University, was working on removing plaster from a lower section of the wall when she noticed something odd. She'd been using soft brushes to clear away debris, the same technique conservators use when excavating archaeological sites, and as the dust cleared, she saw marks on the bricks underneath, scratches that looked deliberate, that looked like letters. She called David over immediately. He knelt beside her, examining the marks, feeling his pulse accelerate as he realized what he was seeing. The scratches were definitely letters, deeply carved into the brick clay. He could make out a T, an H, an O. "Get everyone over here," David said quietly. "And get cameras. Document everything before we do anything else." The crew gathered around as David and Lisa carefully removed more plaster, working slowly, using brushes and gentle tools to expose the bricks underneath. And then they saw it complete. Thomas, March 19, 1859. Below Thomas's name there was another, and below that, another, and another. They worked through the entire day and into the evening, removing plaster inch by inch, exposing more names. Some were carved deeply with clear, precise letters. Others were scratched quickly, barely visible, as if the person doing the carving had been working in desperate haste or near darkness. Some bricks had multiple names layered over each other where space was limited. By midnight, they'd uncovered 47 names in total, each accompanied by a date. The dates ranged from March 3rd to October 14th, 1859. The names were arranged in no particular pattern, some on bricks at eye level, others near the floor or near the ceiling, wherever there had been exposed brick surface before it was covered with plaster. David photographed everything meticulously, documenting each name's exact position in the wall, the depth of the carving, the style of the lettering. Then he sent Lisa to make copies of all the photographs, multiple copies, stored in different locations, because something this significant needed to be preserved redundantly. The next morning, David began researching. The Beaufort County Archives had incomplete records from the antebellum period. The Civil War had destroyed much of the documentation when Union forces occupied the area, but what remained was enough to verify something astonishing. Every single name carved into that wall appeared in Thornbury Hall's 1858 slave inventory. David spent the next week cross-referencing names, dates, and documents. He found bills of sale for each of the 47 people, all dated in 1859, all showing sales to Riverside Plantation, Sumter County, Alabama. The prices listed were absurdly low, ranging from $20 to $45 per person, far below market value for the time. David then did something that would prove crucial. He tried to find records of Riverside Plantation in Alabama. He contacted the Alabama Department of Archives and History, searching their plantation records, land surveys, and agricultural census data. Nothing. He reached out to local historical societies in Sumter County. They had never heard of Riverside Plantation. He examined old maps, tax records, anything that might confirm the plantation's existence. It didn't exist. It had never existed. David compiled all of this into a preliminary report and sent it to the Preservation Society's board, along with a recommendation that they engage a professional historian to investigate further. The board agreed, and they hired Dr. Catherine Morris, a historian specializing in slavery and the antebellum South, who taught at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Morris spent 3 months researching, diving deep into archives in South Carolina, Alabama, and beyond. She confirmed David's finding that Riverside Plantation was fictional, but she went further, looking for patterns that might explain why Samuel Thornbury had created this fiction. What she found was both illuminating and horrifying. In Charleston newspaper archives, Dr. Morris discovered a brief article from February 1860 about a scandal at the Medical College of South Carolina. The article was vague, mentioning only that Dr. Nathaniel Hewitt had been asked to discontinue his teaching position due to concerns about his acquisition methods for anatomical specimens. No details were provided, but the implication was clear. Dr. Hewitt had been obtaining bodies for dissection through methods that even a slave-holding society found questionable. Dr. Morris then found Dr. Hewitt's papers, donated to a medical archive decades earlier. The papers were sanitized. Hewitt had clearly been careful not to document anything explicitly incriminating, but they contained enough circumstantial evidence to construct a disturbing picture. There were ledgers showing payments made to unnamed suppliers throughout 1859 and early 1860. There were research notes describing experimental surgical procedures conducted on subjects who were never identified by name. There were letters from medical students thanking Dr. Hewitt for instructive anatomical demonstrations. And then Dr. Morris found something that connected everything. A single letter, misfiled in the archive, from Samuel Thornbury to Dr. Hewitt, dated March 1st, 1859. The letter had somehow ended up in Hewitt's papers, presumably kept as a record of their arrangement. It was cautiously worded, but its meaning was unmistakable. Dr. Hewitt, I have given consideration to your proposal and am prepared to proceed as discussed. I can provide the subjects you require, delivered in the conditions specified, in exchange for the compensation we agreed upon. I will ensure complete discretion and proper documentation that will satisfy any potential inquiries. The first delivery can be arranged for early March. S. Thornbury. Dr. Morris published her findings in an academic paper in 2018 titled The Hidden Trade. Medical Experimentation and Enslaved Bodies in Antebellum, South Carolina. The paper documented what had happened at Thornbury Hall in 1859, providing evidence that Samuel Thornbury had sold at least 47 enslaved people to Dr. Nathaniel Hewitt for medical experimentation, and that he'd created fictional bills of sale to cover the transactions. The paper was controversial. Some historians praised Dr. Morris for bringing to light a hidden aspect of slavery's brutality. Others criticized her conclusions as speculative, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that alternative explanations were possible. But the physical reality of those 47 names carved into the brick wall was impossible to dismiss. They existed. They had been carved deliberately by people who wanted to leave a record. And the documentary evidence, while incomplete, supported the conclusion that something terrible had happened to the people whose names were preserved in that wall. As Dr. Morris's research was making waves in academic circles, something else happened that would prove just as important. In late 2017, an elderly woman named Patricia Hayes contacted David Hoskins after hearing through her church network about the discovery at Thornbury Hall. Patricia was 92 years old, a retired teacher living in Beaufort, and she told David something that made him sit down abruptly. She was Eliza's great-great-great-granddaughter, and she'd grown up hearing the story of the names in the wall. David met with Patricia at her home, bringing Dr. Morris with him. Patricia showed them a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. "My great-great-grandmother Eliza kept this," Patricia explained. "She dictated her memories to her literate grandchildren in her final years, and they wrote everything down. The family's preserved it ever since, passing it down, even though we never had proof that the story was true." David and Dr. Morris read the journal with hands that shook. Eliza's account, recorded in careful handwriting by her grandchildren, told the same story the bricks did. She described how people had begun disappearing from Thornbury Hall in March of 1859, sold according to official announcements, but actually taken to Charleston for medical experimentation. She described finding the letter from Dr. Hewitt in Samuel's study. She described Marcus carving names into the bricks while Rebecca stood watch. She even described some of the names: Thomas, Grace, Ruth, Marcus, James, all of which appeared on the wall. The journal also contained something else. A list of additional names, people Eliza believed had met the same fate, but whose names weren't carved into the wall, either because they'd disappeared after the renovation work was completed, or because there simply hadn't been enough exposed brick surface to record everyone. This list included another dozen names, and when Dr. Morris checked the records, she found bills of sale for these people too, all dated late 1859 and 1860, all showing sales to fictional plantations. The Preservation Society, faced with this overwhelming evidence, made a decision. Thornbury Hall would be restored, but the east wing parlor wall would be preserved exactly as David's crew had found it, with the names exposed and protected behind climate-controlled glass. The site would become a memorial and museum dedicated not just to telling the story of plantation life, but to specifically honoring the 47 people whose names had survived 158 years hidden in brick. The restoration took another year. The wall with the carved names became the centerpiece of the museum's permanent exhibition. The Preservation Society commissioned research into each of the 47 names, trying to recover whatever biographical information could be found in the fragmentary historical record. For some, only names and dates survived. For others, researchers managed to find additional details: approximate ages, family connections, skills, small pieces of information that restored some measure of humanity to people who'd been treated as less than human. The museum opened to the public in May of 2019. The dedication ceremony was attended by more than 300 people, many of them descendants of enslaved people who'd lived at Thornbury Hall. Patricia Hayes, then 93 years old and in declining health, was the guest of honor. She stood before the wall, now protected behind transparent climate-controlled barriers, and placed her hand against the glass. her fingers tracing the letters carved by Marcus, Rebecca, and James. "They wanted us to remember," Patricia said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the room. They knew no one else would speak for them, so they spoke for themselves. They carved their truth into brick, because brick lasts longer than lies, longer than paperwork, longer than the people who tried to erase them. The museum's exhibition doesn't try to provide simple answers or comforting resolutions. Instead, it presents the evidence. The names, the dates, Eliza's journal, the bills of sale, Dr. Hewitt's papers, Dr. Morris's research, and asks visitors to grapple with what it means. What does it mean that this happened? What does it mean that it was possible? What does it mean that human beings were capable of this level of calculated cruelty, and that other human beings found ways to resist and remember even in the face of it? The museum also addresses broader questions about the relationship between slavery and medical science. Dr. Morris's research revealed that what happened at Thornbury Hall wasn't unique. Medical schools throughout the South maintained anatomy programs that required constant supplies of bodies and enslaved people because they had no legal rights and their deaths triggered no investigations, were the primary source. The Medical College of South Carolina, for instance, openly advertised that its location provided abundant access to anatomical material, a euphemism that everyone understood meant access to enslaved bodies. Some of this was post-mortem dissection, bodies purchased or stolen after natural death. But there's growing evidence that some medical practitioners like Dr. Hewitt went further, conducting experimental procedures on living enslaved subjects without anesthesia or consent. These experiments served multiple purposes. They allowed doctors to test new surgical techniques before attempting them on white patients. They provided dramatic demonstrations for medical students, and they advanced anatomical knowledge through direct observation of living human physiology. The moral implications are staggering. The medical knowledge that benefited countless people in subsequent generations was purchased in part through the torture and death of enslaved people who had no choice, no voice, and no acknowledgement of their suffering. How do we reckon with that? How do we acknowledge the debt owed to people whose names we don't even know, whose stories were deliberately erased? These are the questions that visitors to Thornbury Hall grapple with as they stand before the wall of names. The museum doesn't try to answer them definitively, because honest answers would require confronting truths that American society still struggles to acknowledge fully. David Hoskins, in interviews about the discovery, often reflects on that October morning when Lisa Chen first saw the letters emerging from beneath the plaster. "It was like watching the dead speak," he said. These people had been erased from history, sold away with false records covering their tracks. Their lives ended in ways no one documented or acknowledged. But they'd left this message, this testimony carved into brick, and it survived. It outlasted the man who tried to erase them. It outlasted the war. It outlasted everyone who had reason to suppress it. And now, finally, we're listening. Patricia Hayes died in February of 2021 at the age of 94 from complications related to COVID-19. Her funeral was held at the same church in Beaufort, where Eliza had worshipped after emancipation. Her obituary, published in the Beaufort Gazette, mentioned her role in helping verify the story of the names in the wall, and noted that she'd spent the final years of her life speaking to school groups and historians, sharing what she knew about her family's history. Patricia had told interviewers that discovering the wall had validated generations of family memory. "My whole life, people treated our family story like a myth," she said, "like we were exaggerating or misremembering. But Eliza told the truth. She remembered. And Marcus and Rebecca and James made sure that even if no one believed the survivors, the wall would tell the story eventually." The wall still stands at Thornbury Hall, the 47 names still visible behind their protective glass. Visitors often leave flowers or written notes, small acts of memorial for people they never knew, but whose stories have become important. The museum has expanded its educational programming to include difficult conversations about medical ethics, historical memory, and the ongoing legacies of slavery. The last entry on the wall is dated October 14th, 1859. It's a single name, James. Below it, carved in letters so small they're almost invisible, is a phrase that researchers initially struggled to decipher. It took weeks of careful examination and consultation with linguistic experts to read it clearly. We are not forgotten. James was right, though it took 158 years to prove it. Marcus, Rebecca, Thomas, Grace, Ruth, and the 42 others whose names were carved into that wall, they're not forgotten. Their names are part of the historical record now, taught in schools, visited by thousands of people each year, remembered. It's a small justice, impossibly late, but it's something. It's a testimony that survived when everything else was destroyed. When the people who knew the truth died. When the documents were lost or deliberately falsified. The brick held what paper couldn't, what memory alone might not have preserved. And perhaps that's the most haunting aspect of this story. Not just what happened at Thornbury Hall in 1859, but the fact that it took so long for anyone to look behind the plaster and see what had been hidden there all along. How many other walls in how many other historic buildings might contain similar secrets? How many other voices carved their stories into surfaces we haven't examined yet? How many testimonies are still waiting to be discovered? Dr. Morris, in the conclusion of her academic paper, wrote, "The names in the wall at Thornbury Hall remind us that history isn't just what's written in official records. It's also what's hidden, suppressed, or deliberately erased. Sometimes the truth survives in unexpected places, not in archives or published accounts, but in walls, in family memories passed down through generations, in testimony carved by people who knew they were dying, but insisted on being remembered. Our job as historians is not just to read the official record, but to look for the hidden testimonies, to search for the voices that were silenced, to remember the people who were erased." This story shows us that history is always incomplete, always contested, always in need of re-examination. What else don't we know? What other truths are hidden, waiting for someone to tear down a wall and see what's underneath? What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or might there be more hidden walls, more names waiting to be discovered? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more disturbing historical mysteries like this, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves stories that make you question what we think we know about the past. We'll see you in the next video.